Okay, so I'm recording the webinar as at now, and I'm going to start the broadcast. Best of luck, mate.
Good to you.
Okay.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning and welcome to this Systems Thinking Question and Answer webinar presented by the Executive Education Unit at the University of Adelaide and Dr Barry Bales from the University of Texas. Now, my name's Andrew Stevens. I'm the Director of the Executive Education Unit here at the University of Adelaide, and I'll be facilitating today's Systems Thinking Q&A with Dr Bales. So I'll be asking some questions, but what I would also like the audience to do, if possible, is to answer some questions or ask some questions direct to Barry, and also if you don't have a microphone, is maybe to ask those questions via the question pane. So what I would like to do is just do a little bit of housekeeping and just make sure that as attendees you're familiar with the screens that you're seeing in front of you. First of all, let's just acquaint you with what you're seeing on your screen at the moment. To the left is the GoToWebinar viewer, through which you will see the presentation, and to the right is the control panel. Now, the control panel allows you to answer questions, or ask questions, and also raise your hand and select an audio mode. Now, for most of you, we will have the audio mode of mic and speakers selected. And just a little hint, sometimes this control panel section will actually automatically collapse and hide from view. If you would like to see this control panel all of the time, you come up to this view, which I'm now highlighting. From a drop-down menu in the view, you would select Auto Hide Control Panel and make sure that that is unchecked, and that way you'll see that control panel all of the time. Now, let's show you how you can actually ask questions and participate in this webinar, because I think that the more participation that we can actually get, the better it will actually be. You have a questions panel which you can see highlighted in this bottom red box. This will be, again, on your right hand side. If you would like to choose or enter a question for this session, where it says enter a question for staff, you can actually type that in, press send, and that will come to me as a facilitator of the webinar, and then I can actually pose that question at the appropriate time to Barry. Now, we have also enabled hand raising, which allows you to actually ask an audio question direct to Barry as well. So you can see there highlighted in this bottom screen, again in red, that we have a little picture of a hand. If you click your hand, I will be notified that, one, you have a microphone, so you're able to ask a question in audio format, and you have a question that you would like to pose to Barry directly. So what I can do at the appropriate time is I will unmute the people who have their hands raised, and you can actually ask your question direct to Barry, and you can actually interact direct with Barry as well. Now, I would actually suggest that you do that, because participating in a webinar will actually make it a much better experience, not just for you asking questions, but for all involved. Now, let me introduce Dr Barry Bales, who will be taking over shortly. Dr Barry Bales is the Assistant Dean for Professional Development at the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas in Austin. He holds a PhD in Human Resource Development Leadership, and in his role he currently directs seminars on leadership and executive development for around about 3,000 participants each year. His teaching interests are in organisational learning and development, leadership, executive development, and of course what Barry will be talking to us today about, which is systems thinking. Dr Bales has been involved in developing executives for over 20 years throughout the United States, as well as in China, Brazil, Canada, Latvia, and India, and has also done extensive work here in Australia and also specifically here in Adelaide as such. Now, Barry, do we have you on the line?
Yes, I'm here, Andrew.
Good morning to you, or good afternoon as it is in Texas.
It is.
Now, Barry, I'll make you the presenter, so everyone bear with us just a minute as we switch from me being the presenter to Barry being the presenter.
All right. How does that look?
That looks great, Barry. Thanks very much.
Okay.
Now, maybe if I can start with a question, I think, for those who may not be as familiar with the term of systems thinking, could I just maybe ask you to start with what is systems thinking and why is it different than any other thinking?
Well, a classic definition for it would be that a system by itself is basically a collection of parts that interact with each other to function as a whole. That's what a system is. Systems thinking, especially within a human group, is the tools and processes that allow people to look at the challenges and organizational problems that they encounter from a more holistic, interconnected basis. You can see this quote here that I'm showing on the screen from Russell Ackoff, who was one of the early systems thinkers, that talks about, since a system is interconnected, it's never just the sum of its parts. And how systems thinking differs from what almost the entire world learns as a thinking process, which is a linear thinking process. Linear thinking we learn from the time we're in school, starting school, and it's about looking at problems in a very rational, logical way, breaking the problems down, addressing the pieces of the problem, and then solving the problem that way. That is a great set of tools. It serves us very well in addressing some problems. However, more complex issues and problems don't lend themselves to that way of problem solving. Systems thinking lets us look at the interconnections that sort of give rise to what those problems are.
Okay. But aren't systems just a collection of processes and procedures that designed and implemented, and aren't they just part of what a good manager does?
Well, in my 20 years of working with this, systems thinking absolutely involves processes and tools that managers can use and employ. But at the basis of it is really an understanding that these issues are affected by other pieces. And so it's not only the systems and processes one puts in place, it's the understanding in that manager that allows him or her to put these processes in place, understanding the causality, which is one of the systems principles that will affect the outcome of this problem.
Okay, so does that mean that some parts of the system, as you're describing it, are in the control of a manager, but many parts are not?
Absolutely. Yeah, and let me show you, let me switch to another slide here. Most people know the story about the blind men and the elephant, the 6 blind men that encounter an elephant, and each describes the elephant from the part that he happens to be touching. So the one who grabs the tail says that an elephant is like a snake, and the one that grabs the leg says the elephant is like a tree trunk. Each believing they have described the elephant because they are encountering the elephant with just their hands and not sight. In a very real sense, we as humans are all like these blind men in that we only see part of any problem. Our challenge is that we sort of by default think we see the whole problem. And when we do, in an organization, we think we understand the problem and we proceed in a problem-solving manner using our linear thinking skills. when we're only seeing part of the elephant. We only ever will see part of the elephant. So systems thinking helps us realize there are more factors affecting this, some of which I can imagine, some of which I probably can't, and absolutely some of which are beyond my control. My use of systems thinking, though, is for me to better understand and enhance my understanding of the problems with which I have to deal.
So you mentioned principles. There are principles involved in systems thinking?
Absolutely, and I'll show you a few of them. There's a lot more than this, and some of these are relatively common sense. And here's what I have found too, Andrew, is that all of us think in terms of systems thinking naturally in some areas. Actually, some studies have been shown that small children in school use systems thinking very well and very easily. And then our training in linear thinking takes over and sort of crowds that out. So you will recognize from some of these principles some of the things that seem very common sense. Let me kind of walk through these, if that might be helpful to kind of talk about what each one of these mean. There's a lot more principles than this, but these are the ones that I typically like to focus on. The first and foremost, most powerful in my opinion, principle of systems thinking is that structure drives behavior. Structure are the policies, rules, processes, organizational design, reward systems, incentives, culture, laws. They're the things that affect behavior that we're not always conscious of. Almost like the air that we breathe. The air is vital and necessary for life, but we almost don't think about it because it's invisible to us. That's kind of what this principle says. This principle says there are always structures driving behavior. And how this is important when you understand this and can learn to look and identify what those structures are. And linear thinking doesn't take us there. Then you start understanding why change initiatives that are implemented in an agency often fail. Well, the research on major change initiatives in organizations say about 70% of change efforts fail. I think, one, knowing systems thinking and knowing this principle that structure drives behavior can use that understanding to look at change initiatives and understand why behaviors aren't changing. It helps understand that.
Just on that, Barry, sorry, before you sort of move past that, when I'm speaking to managers, there seems to be an overriding thought that the behaviour that they're seeing in their people is due to personality flaws in those people, that they are, bad or lazy or uncommitted. So are you saying that there's something beyond the person's personality that might be driving their behaviour?
Yeah. Here's what typically happens. When a problem happens in an agency, what is our knee-jerk reaction to do?
Look at the people.
Right, and typically it's to cast blame. Now, I know that the Australian media is not like the U.S. media, but the U.S. media and the legislative people here, when a problem happens within government, for sure, tend to want to know who is at fault, who is to blame about this problem. If you understand this principle that structure drives behavior, the first question that systems thinkers ask isn't who is to blame. The first question is, what about our process allowed this to happen? Because if you understand structure drives behavior, if errors happen, there's a good chance there's something about your process that is rewarding or reinforcing or encouraging behaviors you don't want to see. An example that I like to use in in the classes that I teach is I usually ask people in the class, how many of you have ever exceeded the speed limit? How many hands do you think typically go up?
I think mine's going up at the moment.
Okay. Well, and again, probably in the U.S. we're probably more lawbreakers than you upright citizens in Australia, but typically 100% of the hands go up. And so my question to them is, why do you do this? Why do we break the law? And some people will say, well, because we want to get to our destination. But what it typically is because the laws are not as enforced. The chances of me getting caught are not as great. And so and the consequences, which we'll talk about in just a second, the consequences are not severe enough to change my behavior. Let me hasten to say, when I say consequences, punishment is definitely a structure that drives behavior. However, from an organizational leadership point of view, and that's the lens through which I teach a systems thinking, you cannot punish your way to an excellent operation. You cannot do it. So while punishment is a structure driving behavior, rewards, reinforcement, and recognition also drive behavior. So I use the example about the speeding to say we can have laws, but if we can't enforce them, the structures then will allow behaviors, or will drive behaviors. Not in everybody, but in an organization, you have to identify what are the structures most affecting behavior.
Wouldn't this then be a bit challenging for managers? Because what I'm hearing here is saying that if we're seeing something that's not going the way that we would expect in an organisation, me as a manager should really say, what is my role, rather than apportioning blame to those individuals. So that would be difficult, wouldn't it, to say maybe it's the structures and systems that I have influence over that are affecting behaviour?
Well, I would agree that there are any manager in an organization who is not the CEO will probably have limits on what of the processes he or she can actually affect. However, I also firmly believe from a leadership perspective that what you do from you down, you do have some latitude. You do have some ability to affect the behavior of the people who work for you. And we have seen this proven in all the countries that you mentioned that I have taught in. There are managers who can hold similar levels, and some of them more effective managers than others. Why is that? Is it just personality, or is it that they've also found ways to motivate performance? And when we're talking about motivation, we're talking about structures driving behavior. Again, the kinds of structures that cause people to want to give their best. And that happens, you don't have to be the CEO to have that happen. Now, let me say, there are some large structures governing behavior. For instance, budget. Now, I've worked, most of my systems thinking work has been with government, but I've done a fair amount with private sector too. Here's what I've learned. The principles of systems thinking are the same everywhere in the world because we're dealing with human behavior. The principles are the same. Now, the structures differ. It is true the structures always drive behavior, but the structures, for instance, in Brazil, driving behavior around performance measures is going to be different than it is in the U.S. or Australia. So the structures might differ. But let me just use budget for just a minute. I don't know, I think this is true in Australia, but in the U.S. and in Texas, the budget in Texas for the state budget that goes to state agencies says if you don't use all of your budget at the end of the year, the unspent funds go back to the legislature for reapportioning to other to other agencies. That is a structure-driven behavior, and it makes perfect sense from the legislature's point of view because they have responsibility for oversight and funding of the entire state. But the behavior that drives is for every agency to spend all of its money up, because otherwise they will lose it, and furthermore, they may get a smaller budget the following year.
So use it or lose it that we see here as well, I think.
That is a structure-driving behavior. It's a policy put in place that makes sense from the legislature's point of view, but it has unintended consequences. Let me use that comment to transition to the second principle, which is cause and effect always exist, even if we don't see it. Now, what happens is when we have cause and effect that's real close in time, if you spill boiling water on yourself, you will get burned. That's cause and effect that's real close. You will learn from it. But if you spill the boiling water on you and the burn didn't happen for 3 weeks or a month, you might not attribute that burn to the boiling water. So it's hard to learn from it. That's what this second principle means, is that cause and effect always exists. Sometimes we don't see it. The corollary to this is the law of unintended consequences, which everybody's heard of. That's what I said earlier. Some of these principles are common sense. But the law of unintended consequences, or cause and effect always exists, says there's always going to be a consequence. Systems thinkers know this. So when we're problem solving in an organization and we choose a solution, we know it's going to create new problems somewhere down the road. When those happen, we're more understanding and move back into problem-solving mode. Those people who are not understanding of that, or not knowledgeable of that, tend to start pointing fingers and say, who's to blame? Who can we pin this on now?
Interesting. I see your third one has, I see this a lot, people focusing on symptoms and not problems. Do you want to tell us about that one?
Absolutely. This happens a great deal of the time, and I would partner it with principle number 5 there. But basically what happens is we, in a busy environment, a problem crops up, we tend to try to solve that problem as managers, and with the media and everybody else pointing fingers and looking. We try just to bring some short-term relief to that problem. But it often has us addressing, what we often see then is that same problem will come back around. For instance, those people who are listening in today, if you have children and you take them to the grocery store and your child starts, your 6-year-old or 4-year-old starts crying for some candy, what are you tempted to do to get them to stop crying? Tempted to get them some candy. What are the unintended consequences of that? You're training them that yelling and screaming works, and so they will use it again. That's a quick example of both number 3 and 5, but that we sometimes tend to address symptoms of the problem versus the root cause of the problem, and that leads us to having to go back and try to solve that problem again at some point in the future. There's a systems principle, or systems common pattern of problems called the quick fix. And basically, everybody knows about the quick fix. We as an organization will apply the quick fix just to get temporary relief, knowing we're not really solving the problem.
Barry, just on that, we've had a question come in, I think, from Bernie. If I could just pose that to you now, just related to what we're talking about. Bernie sort of said that he's currently involved in developing financial recovery plans for a large health organisation, and at the current time, he's using, or he's seeing used around him, linear thinking and focusing on symptoms. But how does he sell or introduce systems thinking as a methodology? And I suppose, to obviously a group that hadn't encountered it before.
Great question, and that's one of the core things. Andrew, if you don't mind, I would like to put a plug in that I hope some of the folks listening will consider coming to the 2-day course that I will be teaching for you. where we're going to practice this. But what the core of using systems thinking, in my mind, is in asking questions that help identify the effects of systems principles. Now, so you don't have to, the systems thinker doesn't have to go teach his colleagues or her colleagues systems thinking. What they can do is use systems thinking via the questions they ask. I firmly believe that the questions you ask can change the discourse of a problem-solving group. So, for instance, on each of these principles, we talk about what are the questions that would help identify the effect of this principle. Let me back up for just a moment and suggest a couple. Since structure drives behavior, some of the powerful systems questions might be, what about our process is causing this to happen or allowing this to happen? Another question might be, what behavior are we unintentionally rewarding here or punishing here?
So you're suggesting maybe don't address it as a new way of thinking or talk about systems thinking, but actually use some of the principles to uncover what's actually happening, and then that will make logical sense. Is that what I'm hearing?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So Bernie, I don't know all of the details of what you're doing with this, the financial situations. But I could see you, and I may be off target because I don't understand it, but with a group of people who is responsible for coming up with a plan, might say, what's causing this behavior? What's if people are defaulting or if they're committing fraud or whatever? What about our process, or what about our laws, or what about the way we reward people is encouraging this behavior? There's a number of words that you can use with that. What about our process is encouraging this behavior, is rewarding this behavior, is reinforcing this behavior, is tolerating this behavior? What we know is sometimes merely tolerating behavior is almost like rewarding it. If we are not able to enforce the speed limit, very often, basically, we're tolerating speeding. The answer is not to put more police every quarter mile, because we fiscally cannot afford to do that. It's merely recognizing that there are structures that drive behaviors. How can I ask questions to help identify that? And to lead my group in asking and answering those same kinds of questions.
So once you've asked some questions and you've got a bit of a handle on some of the structures that are driving the behaviour, as you would say, well, how do you change it? What do you do then? Where do you apply pressure? I'm sure Bernie would be interested in that as well.
Yeah, and for our short time tonight, we were just going to talk about some of the principles of systems. In the longer training session, I introduced some tools, several tools. One of them is called causal loop diagramming, where once we understand what's driving behavior, we graphically try to draw a causal loop diagram. Basically, it's a representation of what's going on around that issue or challenge. That tool and that drawing helps us see this issue in a different light and helps identify where we might intervene to have the biggest impact. Let me transition, Andrew, and I don't want to get away from that question, but since I said have the biggest impact, that is number 4 on the principles, that the bottom line of systems thinking is leverage. Basically, that's a concept that traces its roots all the way back to Archimedes. We studied in school that said, give me a lever long enough and single-handedly I can move the world. It's a concept of where do you intervene to have the biggest impact with the least amount of resources. That's when we use these tools collectively to say we can spend a lot, and if if I invite the audience to just think about some of the policies and rules that you have in place, some of which try to control people's behaviors. We can spend a lot of resources and energy trying to get people to a certain outcome. What this fourth principle says is some of those strategies are going to have a bigger impact than others. They're going to have a bigger impact when we understand which structures are really driving behavior. So that helps us then narrow down our choices in problem solving to those things that we think are really going to make a difference.
Okay. So leverage, is that sort of bang for your buck? Is that, where you change a system to get a more beneficial outcome?
Absolutely. It's deciding bang for the buck, but the bang for the buck you can only your identification of the best bang for the buck is greatly enhanced when you understand that structure drives behavior, because then it helps you understand some structures only minimally affect behavior, some structures affect it greatly. That's where leverage is. I'm going to say a word about number 5, because it's one of the most powerful systems principles too.
Yeah, I hear this one sort of talked a little bit about in the arena of politics, shall we say.
Absolutely. This is one that makes perfect sense to everybody, but it is a powerful systems principle. It's our tendency to focus on the short term versus the long term. And here it's because of short-term pressures. And short-term pressures are a powerful structure driving behavior. So here's one quick tip I would offer our listeners this morning. Whenever you see your boss or the head of your agency or your company do something that doesn't make sense to you, here are a couple of questions I would encourage you to ask. You might be tempted to think, what idiot would make a decision like that? Instead, I would ask you to put on your systems thinking hat and say to yourself two things. One, that a management adage is that people's actions make sense from their point of view. My job is not to agree with their point of view. My job is to try to understand their point of view that would lead to this kind of decision. Point 2 comes back to our principle here, and that's this. What short-term pressures is he or she feeling? Because we know that short-term pressures are a powerful driver of behavior. Always. So as far as a systems question that I always ask, there's lots and lots of systems questions to get at these principles. You can ask them lots of different ways. But I can tell you there's 2 or 3 or 5 that I ask all the time when I get brought into companies to do some consulting work. One of them I already mentioned. What about our processes allowing this to happen? What behaviors are being rewarded or punished? The third powerful one beyond those 2 is, what are the short-term pressures being felt by key people around this issue? The answer to that helps you understand why behaviors are going to happen in the way that they happen. And we have to address and take into consideration those short-term pressures.
Do you have an example, Barry? Is there anything that comes to mind that helps illustrate that?
Absolutely. In the U.S., I suspect it probably happens occasionally in Australia, but in the U.S., during the election cycle, which seems to be nonstop here now, most politicians take a vow when they first start running for office that says they are not going to do any negative campaigning. Ultimately, they or their surrogates always end up doing it, because I believe of short-term pressures. And here's how it works. They all mean it when they say it. And then one of them gets ahead of the other one in the polls, and the one that's behind has a choice to make. I can lose this election, or I don't really think of it as negative campaigning, but I can let the public know these underhanded things that my opponent's doing. And once that happens, it spirals. Now the other opponent feels that short-term pressure, and this is what drives it. And what happens, though, is it works for citizens, because now, as a voter, I'm listening to politician A who's doing negative campaigning. I don't like politician A because politician A is being underhanded in negative campaigning. But neither do I like politician B now that I've heard these things about politician B. What happens is the short-term pressure drives these behaviors in the short run, but the long-term consequences is a loss of status and a growth of cynicism among the voters. And we respond. I know in Australia, by law, everybody has to vote. In the U.S., we don't have to vote. The voting percentages go down egregiously, and it's because of things like that. It's an example of short-term pressures having a long-term consequence.
Yeah, and I think you see that in our political cycle as well. Some of the decisions that our politicians make because of the pressure of the media, and obviously that they're on at maximum 4-year cycle for re-election. Well, now, this last principle here, eroding goals, do you want to talk a little bit about that one?
Yeah, that's one that there's a rule of I think it's called thermodynamics, but it's a rule of entropy that things tend toward erosion over time. This system principle basically says that our goals will erode over time, and they will do so unless we stop them. And all I'm suggesting from this principle is to recognize that happens. For instance, in some of our social service agencies, they will have a ratio of caseworkers to actual cases being worked. And there's a certain percentage of that. Over time, that ratio gets higher and higher and higher. And it happens because of budget pressures. It happens for lots of reasons. But we're faced with a decision. Do we hire more caseworkers and keep the ratio the same, or do we let the ratio grow? And that's one of those eroding goals kinds of things.
Okay. So, I get a sense that there's probably certain types of challenges and issues that systems thinking is more appropriate for, and that you're not suggesting that we just throw out linear thinking?
Absolutely not. Linear thinking probably serves us well most of the time. Here's what we know. The higher up you get in an organization, the more complex are the issues with which you have to deal. More complex issues probably need systems thinking in order to really understand more of the elements. I can show you here on this next page here, Andrew, people who are much smarter than me, have been studying this for years and years and years and years, have found that as unique as we like to think we are, there are common patterns of problems that happen within an organization. Here are just some of them. There's more. They call them archetypes, but that kind of sounds jargony. Let's just call them common patterns of problems. The quick fix, or rather fixes that fail, that is a common type of problem. Shifting the burden is a common pattern of problems. I invite our audience to think through the issues they're currently dealing with and see if they fall into one of these categories. Shifting the burden is when you respond in a quick fix manner because of short-term pressures. That's a problem. But over time, you erode an organization's capacity to effectively fix the real problem. Limits to growth. It says that growth is not going to go on and on and on and on. Even the highest and fastest growing companies, the systems problem of limits to growth say there will be some factors that stall growth at some point. Drifting goals. That's kind of the eroding goals example that I already talked about. Success to the successful. This is where we tend to give more resources to the successful people or agencies and give less resources to those who are not, which compounds our problem of building our bench strength. And finally, tragedy of the commons is a group of problems that say if we have to share a resource like purchasing or finance or photocopy shop, that if we have to share the resource, people will start trying to get theirs while the getting's good. I can see we're almost out of time. Let me do one more slide here because these are some of those specific organizational problems that are common that fit one or more of those patterns that I just showed you. I'd invite our audience to look at that and see, have you experienced any of these problems? For instance, change initiatives that are not working, or ill-defined performance expectations, or there's been cases of tolerating poor performance in the workforce. Some people can survive not getting their job done, and it makes other people angry that they're working hard. Or looking at short-term objectives, or working in silos. This is a real common one where an organization or CEO will come to me and say that our people are not taking an organization-wide perspective. They're just working in silos. These are all common type of problems for which systems thinking is helpful in terms of trying to address solutions.
And I think in a lot of organisations you would see a combination of those depending on what the particular issue or problem is.
And every one of those I'm talking about here, there are structures that drive those behaviors. And it's been said that your system is perfectly designed for the results you are currently getting. Meaning, if you want different results, you've got to change the system.
Now, knowing full well that we've got a couple of minutes to run, Barry, I might just start to wind things up, and then also, again, offer that anyone who'd like to ask an audio question directly to Barry to, take this opportunity to put their hand up while I'm sort of saying my last couple of things. Just quickly, Barry, before we sort of go off, is how do you learn more about systems thinking? I mean, this is 45 minutes, and they're quite large concepts that you're talking about. So can you learn this in a short amount of time?
I can tell you that I have a different view of that than some of the long-term gurus in this field. Some feel like you've got to study this stuff for years in order to really master it. I don't believe that. I believe that understanding the principles of systems thinking can help you ask questions, systems kinds of questions that help you deal with problems in a more holistic way. What I have found is one of the big barriers to this is habit. We have a default problem-solving mode that we go to without thinking. I teach this course in 2 days. Occasionally I'll teach it in a shorter period of time. In the 2 days I do introduce the tools of systems thinking, which again helps you look at the problems and issues in a little more deep way. But ultimately it's about practice. I can teach you the principles and the tools and then help you start practicing, and then give you some suggestions for continued practice. And the more practice you have, the more comfortable you are in using these tools and processes.
Now, we do have a couple of questions. I know Mick has asked a question, but what we might do, Barry, if it's okay, is I might just sort of ask you to close now, and then we might come if there's a couple of questions. Are you okay to maybe answer a couple of questions after our time?
Sure.
And then that way those who have to go, I understand, may have other commitments as such. So Is there anything you'd like to say to wrap up what it is that we've, some very interesting concepts we've heard this morning?
Sure. We live in a complex world, and the people listening are facing complex problems. Systems thinking is not a magic bullet. It doesn't make you taller and smarter and more handsome. It won't solve all of the complex problems that you have to deal with. But I truly believe, and I have studied this for years and taught this and believe it, systems thinking tools can help enhance your understanding of the complex problems. We may never see the whole elephant. We probably won't see the whole elephant. Systems thinking are going to help us see a lot more of it than we're seeing now.
Excellent. Thank you, Barry. Again, we'll come back in a minute and answer a couple of questions if there still are some. But for those of you who have to go on to other commitments, just on behalf of the Executive Education Unit and the University of Adelaide, thank you, Barry, for speaking with us today.
My pleasure.
There's certainly a lot of things to think, and as you said, people study this their entire lives, so we've really only got a snapshot. And I also would like to thank the audience for their attention today and coming along and maybe taking a first step on the journey to maybe pushing their thinking and being more effective as managers and leaders in their organisations. As some of you will know, we're really fortunate. Barry will be coming over to Adelaide for a one-only 2-day program that we've got on the Monday the 4th and Tuesday the 5th of June. So doing, as Barry mentioned in his webinar and some of the responses, a 2-day program which is delivered all over the world to start to give you some of these principles in more detail and allowing you to then go and apply them and to practice them in your organisations as such. Now, if you'd like more information about that, please feel free to contact either myself, Andrew Stevens, or Rosemary Tanner from the Executive Education Unit, either by phone or by email, and I'm sure we can help out. There are still places available at this stage on that program. So for those of you who have to leave us there, once again, thank you for your attention. For those of you who can stay for a little bit, Barry, we have an interesting question that's come in from Mick, which is, he's asked, are linear thinking and systems thinking separate and distinct processes, or is systems thinking just using linear thinking in a more holistic context? Now, I'm glad that you've got to answer that and not me.
Gee, I'm not sure I have an answer for that. Mick, that's a great question. Repeat that middle part. Is it using linear thinking in a more systemic way?
Well, what I think is that Mick's asking, are there two different schools of thought, linear and systems that are separate, or is systems just encompassing linear but extending it on?
Well, I think it is a departure from linear thinking in this sense. Linear thinking would posit that if we can break the problem down into parts, we can better solve the parts. There are some complex problems that, like the analogy of the elephant, it doesn't help you understand the elephant by cutting it into parts. It may help a biologist to understand certain pieces of it, but it doesn't help you understand the working of it to cut it in parts, because the essence of the elephant is in its whole. So that's one departure, that it's not merely an extension of linear thinking. It is sort of a quantum leap. It's sort of different in the sense that you're looking at the whole, and to look at the whole, you're going to have to use some different processes and tools to do so.
So there's times when linear thinking may be beneficial. I suppose the old analogy, if you was taking apart a clock, then linear thinking is probably quite good because you can break it down into its component parts. But if you was taking apart the brain, for instance, having a look at the bits of the brain by cutting it up doesn't really help us understand what it does.
Right. That's exactly right. And here's an example of a process that's linear, that's an outstanding process. When you have process design, where you are looking at sort of like a lean manufacturing process, and you're squeezing squeezing out the inefficiencies. That is outstanding. That's an outstanding skill to have, to understand how we can make our processes, internal processes, more efficient. How systems thinking, though, would look at those same processes and say, what's driving behavior? The process of the steps in a process don't always drive behavior. They enable behavior. They don't necessarily drive it. So looking at systems may be, in some cases, this is maybe a crude analogy to use, but you've heard the saying about rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic.
I've certainly heard that one. We use that over here quite a lot.
Okay, so the linear analysis might be, how do we best set up the deck chairs? The systems piece would say, well, wait a minute, let's look at this larger. Setting up the deck chairs in any configuration is not going to change the outcome.
Yeah. Now we've got one last question, I think. Again, it's a typed question. No one's joined us on the audio this morning, Barry, unfortunately. You must be sounding way too scary for most, I think.
I didn't mean to be.
But Matt's got a question saying, and this is not a bad place to finish because it deals with change. And his question is, how do you deal with a situation where an organisational change is seen as having a negative impact at an operational level?
Good, good. Thanks, Matt, for that question. I think systems thinking tools are absolutely critical for managing change. I can't even understand how the 30% of change efforts that work do so without some at least intuitive knowledge about systems. The answer I would give Matt is not strictly a systems answer, but remember, I teach systems in the larger context about leadership and what we know about leadership. Some of the changes that do have some negative consequences at the operational level, systems thinking is not going to make that necessarily better. So here's the kind of the 2 or 3 part answer that I might give. Sometimes there are some changes that are implemented that, for whoever decides, have to be done, that some people are going to lose at. It's going to be painful. There are going to be some negative consequences. Systems thinking is not going to make that any better. Now, if you want to change behavior, systems thinking can help you say, how do we change our processes to reward, reinforce the new behaviors, and how do we remove the unintentional rewards for the old behaviors? That doesn't mean people are going to like it. When you're dealing with those kinds of issues, you move over into other aspects of leadership, some of which involves motivation. It involves the emotional intelligence quotient of some of the leaders. It involves that knowledge about people tend to support what they help to create. It gets into vision. It gets into saying that the leader probably ought to be talking, gathering everybody together and not just foisting this change on people, but saying, here's the reality. We have to do this. I need your help to make it work. We're all on this boat together. That's understanding some of that human stuff, not just system stuff.
Also, I suppose that from what I hear you saying this morning is to maybe before you enter into the change or even during the change is that it's probably not linear. It's not the harder you pull as a manager, the more change you're going to enact at the other end, but to understand it in a systemic way that I suppose more like a spider web, if I use that analogy, where you do pull, something happens where you want it to, but other things do happen as well.
Absolutely. Change is never, this is probably too broad a statement to say, but I'll say it anyway. Change is never just a linear process because it's involving humans with all of their fears and concerns and the emotions involved. It is going to, so you have to align your behaviors through systems thinking to try to get to the behavior you want to see, and you've got to address those people's concerns.
Excellent. Now we are now out of time. Thank you, Barry, for answering those questions at the end of the webinar. I think they were two very good questions by Mick and Matt. I really look forward. Sorry, go on.
I said tell Matt and Mick thanks for the questions.
So hopefully they listen long enough to hear the answers.
Okay.
Now I really look forward to welcoming you down in Adelaide at the start of June.
Can't wait.
Hopefully meeting some of the people that you may have heard or may have heard you speak today. So on that
Sounds
note,
great.
Thank you for your time, Barry. Thank you, attendees, for attending. Hopefully it's been a worthwhile investment, and getting up maybe a little earlier and coming into work was worth it. So thank you very much for that. Thank you, Barry. Thank you, attendees. And if you need any more information, please feel free to contact the University of Adelaide's Executive Education Unit, either myself, Andrew Stevens, or Rosemary Tanner. Thanks very much.
Thanks.